Falcon, what did you do?
I just asked a question! Alright guys, before you douse my home in kerosene for doubting the supremacy of the aircraft-mounted gun, hear me out. The gun has served air forces of the world greatly for 90 plus years, and this is not advocating for the removal of them. I mean, let's be real. Who doesn't love the sight of a 6-barreled Vulcan cannon spitting out flame like a dragon, with 60 rounds per second ripping into a MiG and shredding it into pieces like a tin can? Ugh. But I want to ask you guys, how often does that happen? Since the Vietnam War, out of 50 recorded air-to-air kills by the US Air Force and Navy, only 2 were gun kills performed by A-10s against HIP helicopters, and in case you didn't know, the A-10 is not designed for air-to-air combat. Of course, here and there you'll find the occasional gun kill in a third-world conflict among small prop jobs, but one really has to think, how important is the gun in the modern arena? I'll let you decide that for yourselves at the end. To understand the reason for everyone having such a hard-on over the aircraft-mounted gun, we have to look back at the first time its relevance was called into question. In the 1950s, the primary threats to American coastlines and carrier fleets were Soviet bombers like the Tu-95 Bear. As such, the emphasis on dogfighting with other fighters was taken over by fast-flying missile-wielding interceptors. The F-4 Phantom, a personal favorite of mine, was a flying brick designed to fly as fast as possible and deploy its Sparrow missiles at up to some 20 miles, which neared the beyond visual range. Of course, you don't want to wait for the bombers to get within range of their own cruise missiles, so fuel space was a premium, as was a large radar for painting targets at long range. Because the fighting was supposed to take place in these environments, the Navy's Mark IV cannon was omitted. We all have to remember that hindsight is 20/20, so when the F-4 was the primary fighter for the Air Force and Navy, it found itself in a fight it really wasn't designed for: the skies of Vietnam. Vietnam is a tropical and mountainous environment, a far cry from the flat oceans where the Air Force and Navy anticipated its next war. The BVR rules discussed prior were rendered useless not only by the terrain, but by the rules of engagement. When you're in an air war over land, you have a ton of assets from both sides flying in and out of the combat zone. Not only do you have allied bombers hitting targets, you have helicopters dropping off troops, and cargo planes dropping off, Agent Orange? One step to deal with the issues of BVR fighting was Identification Friend or Foe, or IFF, which was a transponder that flashed a certain frequency that tracking systems would be able to pick up on. If you flashed the right code, you'd be painted as a friendly. Simple, right? Well, not in the 1960s. Not only did not everyone get an IFF transponder, but reliability was in question. The last thing an Air Force wants to do is kill a friendly, so what was the solution? Well, spotting targets visually. So you had an F-4 Phantom, designed to fight at 20 miles, being brought in close so the pilots had to pick out individual aircraft like MiGs or, who was a friendly and who wasn't. This is where it gets fun. The Soviet-built MiGs used by the North Vietnamese were built for this arena. Up close, the Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles could still engage, but required specific envelopes for a good shot. For example, the heat-seeking Sidewinder required a pilot to be on the ass end of a MiG for a good tone. Sparrows could shoot from the front quarter, but the speed of the two aircraft merging only gave the F-4 crews mere seconds to lock on amongst the mountains and jungle clutter, and take a shot before the oncoming MiG was in the minimum engagement range for the missile to even detonate. Meanwhile, the more maneuverable MiG-17s and 21s had little trouble engaging with their cannons, while the fast and slow-turning F-4s fought at a handicap. The Air Force's solution to close-in dogfighting was the Su-16 gun pod, a 20mm cannon that replaced the centerline fuel tank. The Su-16 wasn't even linked to the F-4's gun sight, so the pilots had to basically make hip shots cowboy style to make a kill. They had to spray and pray. Later systems did show up, and the Air Force did end up with several MiG kills via cannon, so it's easy to accept the idea that the gun was the solution to the problem. But it's a little more complicated than that. The US Navy went its own route and developed Top Gun, which focused more on dogfighting tactics to use against the communist MiGs. Navy F-4s never received a gun, but their kill ratio increased dramatically, and I think that deserves a video on its own. Regardless, the idea that the gun was the king of close combat was cemented even to this day. Every air combat aircraft after the F-4 had provisions for a gun as to not repeat the losses in Vietnam. Alright, here we go. Invoking the name Pierre Spray these days is essentially the Godwin's Law of aviation history nerds. You know what? We're not even gonna go there. The revisionists like the late Mr. Spray were frauds who had no actual influence over the development of modern military aircraft, despite all they said and the pull they had over the uninformed masses. We're gonna skip this one. Next. 1991, Desert Storm. IFF tech had been improved and the success of the Sparrow missile really shined as the super fighter that is the F-15 Eagle mowed down MiG-21s, 25s, and 29s. While the rules of engagement still persisted, the IFF improvements allowed F-15s to make longer-range shots they needed, and even when they ended up in visual-range dogfights, better Sidewinder missiles allowed for kills during maneuvering once thought impossible in the 1960s. As we went over before, the only 2 gun kills were done by A-10s, which lacked much in the way of air-to-air capabilities, so the gun truly was the only choice in the matter. Even then, they wrecked a pair of Mi-8 hips, which is a feat on its own, but a far cry away from supersonic gun kills of Nam. Honestly, after 1991, the only jet air-to-air gun kill I can find any documentation of is a Venezuelan F-16A shooting down an OV-10 Bronco in 1992, which has some great video documentation. And since then, it's been 30 years, hard to believe. There's not been an instance of jet fighters using an internal cannon to shoot down another aircraft. Of course, it is important to note that through the Great War on Terror, guns have been known to be used for ground attack and strafing very extensively. However, these were often situations where no other weapon was at the disposal of the aircraft called upon. For example, an F-14D Super Tomcat flown by J. Faceshot Consalvi was called upon to do a strafing run in support of coalition forces in 2004. I just want to note that this is the only time the F-14 fired its gun in anger over the course of its 35 years of US service. And before you say, "Oh, Falcon, what about Iran?" The only other user of the F-14, Iran, used its gun once in 1980 to down an Mi-25 Hind versus 144 missile kills over the course of 8 years. Anyway, back to it. So gun kills with jets are only getting rarer and rarer as technology improves. So we have to wonder, does carrying a 250-pound M61 Gatling cannon and its near-ton of ammunition make sense anymore when the space could be used for more advanced sensors or jamming equipment? I would personally say the gun should not be carried at the expense of, say, an IRST sensor, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should go ripping out cannons from our planes. Missile technology, especially in the AIM-120 AMRAAM and the A9X Sidewinder, provided engagement envelopes never before imagined in the 1960s. Forget shooting at 20 miles for a BVR kill, think of something closer to about 80 to 100 miles. Even if you get close enough for within visual range engagement, the AIM-9X Sidewinder can shoot a target at all aspects, and when coupled with a helmet-mounted display, can reliably nail an enemy aircraft with the pilot looking over his shoulder 90 degrees. The days of having to maneuver onto a target's tail for a missile shot a la Vietnam are long gone. I won't say the gun has no place in a dogfight, but the idea of it as a primary weapon is basically over. If anything, it's a last-ditch weapon for use in an oh shit moment. Think of it this way. A soldier or marine on the ground has a rifle and a limited amount of space on his kit to stock ammunition, communication gear, first aid, water, etc. A pistol as a backup to his rifle takes up valuable real estate. Now, if you're able to carry a sidearm without the expense of leaving important equipment behind, great. But if you end up using that sidearm, you or someone else has fucked up royally. You've used all your rifle ammunition, any artillery support you've had, any tank support you've had, it's all failed. It's just you and a pistol against a guy. This is why the F-35B and C variants lack an internally mounted gun. The B model needs the space for a lift fan, and the C needs extra fuel being an aircraft carrier variant. Now, if the situation calls for a gun to be necessary, they do have the option to take an external gun pod with them. However, I've seen very few images of them being equipped with them at the fleet. Anyway, that was a long one, and like always, I do suggest you to read into these things on your own. If you think I'm wrong, I'd like to see what you have to say, and maybe we can learn something together. Also, if you enjoyed the artwork done by Hellion Manor, the link to the Patreon is in the description. I'm Falcon, and thanks for watching, and as always, keep the sun at your back.